planet is Earth. It's 4.5 billion years old. Humans only recently emerged here. 1.5 million years ago, they began using fire. Charcoal and shards of burnt clay are the first traces of humans on Earth. 10,000 years ago, farming was born. Domesticated animals, farmlands, man-made canal systems and water bodies altered the planet over the years. The 16th century AD, after the discovery of America, civilization went global. The New World's indigenous people died en masse. Huge territories were abandoned and overrun by trees. This reduced carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. The 18th century, the steam engine was invented, heralding the Industrial Revolution. In the middle of the 20th century, humanity started using nuclear power. With every step, our impact on the planet has been increasing. On July 16, 1945, the US conducted the first ever test of a nuclear bomb. The Soviet Union detonated its first bomb in 1949. Great Britain followed suit in 1952.
The outstanding feature of the 20th century has been the enormous expansion in the numbers who are given the opportunity to share in the larger and more varied life which in previous periods was reserved for the few and for the very few. This process must continue at an increasing rate. If we are to bring the broad masses of the people in every land to the table of abundance, it can only be by the tireless improvement of all our means of technical production and by the diffusion in every form of education of an improved quality to scores of millions of men and women. Even in this startling hour, I have faith that this process will go on. If, with all the resources of modern science, we find ourselves unable to avert world famine, we shall all be to blame. But a peculiar responsibility would rest upon the scientists. I do not believe that they will fail. But if they do, or perhaps were not allowed to succeed, the consequences would be very unpleasant, because it is quite certain that mankind would not agree to starve equally. And there might be some very sharp disagreements about how the last crust was to be shared. As our greatest intellectual authorities here will readily admit, that would simplify our problem in an unduly primordial manner.
We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. The need to maintain balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable, balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual, balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love.
But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty, the possibility for the pursuit of happiness.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. And the real question is whether we have the will. All the civil rights leaders, for various reasons, refuse or can't take a stand or have to go along with the administration. That's their business. But I'm afraid that I know that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is the threat to justice everywhere.
We all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again.
The year is 1963. Nuclear powers sign the treaty banning nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. But the traces left by the tests remain.
This is one of the nation's best sellers. Up to now, 500,000 copies have been sold, and Silent Spring has been called the most controversial book of the year.
Rachel Carson's push to limit the use of powerful pesticides like DDT helped spark the American environmental movement.
Rachel Carson is one of those rare individuals who brought about change in all of our lives.
The naturalist and science writer Rachel Carson spent decades urging Americans to see the beauty around them. But in 1962, Carson published Silent Spring, and her message took on a markedly different tone.
Man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself.
To Carson, that war was exemplified by the growing use of DDT, a potent synthetic insecticide that was so revered for its ability to kill malaria-carrying mosquitoes during World War II that its discovery led to a Nobel Prize.
This diabolical weapon of modern science saved millions of humans, but killed billions of insects. Man, with this newly discovered force, has at long last gained the upper hand in our age-old struggle.
DDT was soon billed as the solution to every insect pest. And in time, upwards of 80 million pounds was being sprayed annually in the U.S. alone, applied to everything from vast forests and cropland to spreading tracts of suburban American homes.
Once a bug comes in contact with DDT, he's lost. The effect is disastrous.
But Carson's research showed the massive spraying of DDT and other insecticides was causing a hidden harm.
We poison the caddisflies in a stream, and the salmon runs dwindle and die. We poison the gnats in a lake, and the poison travels from link to link of the food chain. We spray our elms, and the following springs are silent of robin song.
Time magazine called Miss Carson's book an emotional and inaccurate outburst.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment. You can't just step in with some brute force and change one thing without changing a good many others. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we must never interfere, that we must not attempt to tilt that balance of nature in our favor. But unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster.
There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's book, but they are.
Evidence mounted that DDT was a persistent and damaging environmental toxin. Its pervasive spraying raised increasing political and scientific alarm.
A government-backed scientific panel today reported that pesticides may indeed represent a grave threat to mankind.
The average American already has more DDT in his body than is permitted in the meat and fish that we eat. It does not go away, it accumulates, and it passes to babies through their mother's milk.
There was a time when an American who was about to go overseas would be warned not to drink the water. But now we have such a tremendous water pollution problem in our fjords and an air pollution problem also that if any of you are thinking of coming to the United States, I would suggest that you heed the warning in the following song. If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. Pollution, pollution, we got smog and sewage and mud. Turn on your tap and get hot and cold running crud. See the halibuts and the sturgeons being wiped out by detergents. Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly, but they don't last long if they try. Pollution, pollution, you can use the latest toothpaste and then rinse your mouth with industrial waste. Just go out for a breath of air and you'll be ready for Medicare. The city streets are really quite a thrill. If the hoods don't get you, the monoxide will. Pollution, pollution, wear a gas mask and a veil. Then you can breathe long as you don't inhale. Lots of things there that you can drink, but stay away from the kitchen sink. Throw out your breakfast garbage, and I've got a hunch that the folks downstream will drink it for lunch. So go to the city, see the crazy people there, like lambs to the slaughter. They're drinking the water and breathing the air.
50 years ago, when the common market was born, what people wanted most was peace and prosperity for Europe. Caring for the environment didn't feature in the founding Treaty of Rome. Yet environmental problems were not far away. Europe's love affair with the car was moving into top gear. Industry was building up. By the 1970s, it was clear that minimum standards needed to be set for water and air pollution, as well as waste management.
The Greenpeace story started in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was the time of the Cold War and nuclear arms race. In 1969, the Americans announced an underground test, the detonation of a 1 megaton bomb on the island of Amchitka in Alaska, 7,000 kilometers northwest of Vancouver. In October 1969, thousands of activists protested against the Amchitka nuclear tests at the border between British Columbia and Washington state. But the Americans went ahead. They detonated the bomb and announced plans for a second nuclear weapon test in a year. To protest, a Quebecer and an American Quaker couple formed the Don't Make a Wave Committee, which was the precursor of Greenpeace. Inspired by the pacifist Quaker tradition, the committee proposed sending a ship into the American nuclear testing zone in Alaska.
Earth Day demonstrations began in practically every city and town in the United States this morning, the first massive nationwide protest against the pollution of the environment. In Washington, there was an awesome Earth Day warning from a government scientist. Dr. J. Murray Mitchell said pollution and overpollution, unless checked, could so warm the Earth in 200 years as to create a greenhouse effect, melting the Arctic ice cap and flooding vast areas of the world.
Captain John Cormack agreed to sail to Amchitka with 12 Greenpeace members during the dangerous stormy season. The crew left Vancouver on September 15, 1971.
The Greenpeace has now been out nearly a month on its voyage of protest against the U.S. hydrogen bomb test at Amchitka in the western.
Two Greenpeace members, journalists Bob Hunter and Ben Metcalf, filed reports from the ship to newspapers and radio stations. 15 days after its departure, the ship was stopped by the U.S. Coast Guard. The crew were warned not to go any further and were released. Without the knowledge of the Phyllis Cormack crew, Greenpeace in Vancouver decided to charter a second, bigger and faster ship. But on November 6th, the bomb was detonated before either of the two ships could intervene. Although the Greenpeace mission didn't prevent the explosion, it was widely reported in the press and drew public attention to the nuclear tests. It was the group's first campaign and first media victory. A number of countries, including Canada, called for a moratorium on the nuclear tests. A few months later, the United States announced it was ending its Amchitka nuclear testing program.
Herds of deer graze peacefully in the African bushland, while at the other end of the world, baby seals drift lazily on the Arctic ice floes. But both are linked by the same threat, man and his greed. Since 1600, 1 in every 100 species of bird and mammal has become extinct, and 3% of those left alive are now under severe threat from man. United Nations Secretary General U Thant.
The total effects of changes within all countries, added together, will require joint international surveillance, consultations, and actions if human life on this planet is to be preserved and enriched.
All nature's creations are relative to each other, intertwined in an undiminishing cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Man, the innovator, is the only living organism to move away from the set cycle and create his own unnatural habitat, the city. In his drive for independence, man has moved from the shelter of nature into the artificial life of a manufactured community, a monument to superiority over nature and his vanity. But the city utterly fails as an artificial environment in at least one punishing aspect. Unlike nature, it does not replace what it uses. Instead, the city industriously goes about creating an environment of waste, useless and dangerous waste. Man is rapidly approaching the stage where, with the continued growth of these communities, his entire planet may become engulfed in a conglomeration of buildings, factories, and stinking piles of refuse. Millions of gallons of human sewage flow out of these cities with daily regularity. Much is simply pumped into nearby rivers and streams, where it combines with lethal industrial waste. Each year, more rivers are added to the list of dead waterways. The main river wrecker is industry, using colossal quantities of water and pumping back millions of gallons of toxic effluent. In the United States in 1968, more than 15 million fish died as a result of water pollution, and in Britain, more than 1,000 miles of inland waterway are seriously polluted. But industry is not entirely to blame. As more and more land is devoured by agriculture to feed the world's spiraling population, advanced farming technology is taking a terrible toll of the environment. Chemicals such as DDT run off into streams which carry them into the marshlands and lakes, home to much of the world's wildlife. The most dangerous feature of such chemicals is the way in which they are concentrated in food cycles. Daily, we are confronted with the effects of our complex society. As we consume nature's resources to feed our industry, these processes are in turn destroying our environment. Conservationists have warned that unless immediate measures are taken, this generation of humans may go down in history as the greatest destructive vandals of all time.
In 1972, in an experiment called The Limits to Growth, an international panel of statisticians looked into the future of the planet. Instead of a crystal ball, they used a computer. They programmed in predictions of population expansion and economic activity. The results were shocking.
Our book, Limits to Growth, was the first concrete effort using a computer to look at trends that unfold over decades, even a century. We were trying to understand long-term physical demands on the planet. And in the 70s, we were thinking that probably in the period 2010 to 2030 was when the planet would start to encounter limits. And that when you hit the limits, the tendency is to overshoot them and collapse, not to even out in a nice, orderly fashion. The book was officially released in March of 1972, and the inaugural event was a press conference in Washington, D.C.
To have this opportunity.
The book was rather quickly translated into 35 languages and sold millions. It was a phenomenon.
From a very large number of computer runs, making various assumptions, adopting various maxima and minima, there is in fact a general forecast of a breakdown of world society in the first decades of the next century.
Here is what Dr. Meadows' computer shows. Since the year 1900, the Earth's resources, there at the top of the chart, have been steadily used up as population, food consumption, and production of goods have soared. Ahead of us, sometime after the year 2000, this computer study foresees calamity. Resources drop more steeply, and food and production follow suit. Population continues to expand for perhaps one more generation, then collapses calamitously as deprivation takes hold.
The Limits to Growth suggested the world faced a stark choice: cut down waste or face imminent global collapse.
Stockholm, Sweden, June 12, 1972. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India, arrived today to address the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. She was met by the Secretary General of the conference, Mr. Maurice Strong, who escorted Mrs. Gandhi to the rostrum.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. No one amongst us, whatever our status, strength or circumstance, can remain unaffected. Countries with but a small fraction of the world's population consume the bulk of the world's production of minerals, fossil fuels, and so on. Thus we see that when it comes to the depletion of natural resources and environmental pollution, the increase of one inhabitant in an affluent country at his level of living is equivalent to an increase of many Asians, Africans, or Latin Americans at their current material levels of living. The inherent conflict is not between conservation and development, but between environment and the reckless exploitation of man and earth in the name of efficiency.
If we do not save the environment, then whatever we do in civil rights or in a war against poverty will be of no meaning, because then we will have the equality of extinction.
And all of a sudden, people say, wait a second, this is not how we have to live.
Each of us all across this great land has a stake in maintaining and improving environmental quality, clean air and clean water, the wise use of our land, the protection of wildlife and natural beauty, parks for all to enjoy. These are part of the birthright of every American. To guarantee that birthright, we must act, and act decisively. It is literally now or never. During the past 3 years, we have made a good start. We have passed new laws to protect the environment, and we have mobilized the power of public concern. But there is much yet to be done. The environmental agenda now before the Congress includes laws to deal with water pollution, pesticide hazards, ocean dumping, excessive noise, careless land development, and many other environmental problems. These problems will not stand still for politics or for partisanship. They demand to be met now. By meeting them now, we can make 1972 the best year ever for environmental progress. The time has come for man to make his peace with nature.
A ragtag band of ecologists put their bodies on the line in defense of environmental issues. They got their name at the end of a meeting when Irvin Stowe, an elder pacifist, said, "Peace." Someone called out, "Make it a Greenpeace." The name stuck, and Greenpeace brought together the ecology and anti-war movements for the first time.
We were asking the question, okay, the war in Vietnam's over, and what are we going to do next? And the answer to that question was, we're going to start an ecology movement. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go save the whales.
What we put into effect was a plan that Bob Hunter had come up with from reading a lot of Gandhi. He felt that we could just put ourselves between the harpoon and the whales and they wouldn't kill the whales.
It wasn't just a matter of holding up signs saying, stop killing the whales. No. Greenpeace wanted to get out there in front of the whaling boats and stop them.
All the Greenpeace is a-sailing, they're crazy as hell. They'd be riding a big ocean in a hollowed-out shell. They'll probably get seasick, or they'll probably go blind. They're probably on drugs, or at least out of their minds. Now what is a whale but a big hunk of flesh? Let's poke 'em and stab 'em and steal his breath.
In 1975, Greenpeace set off to hunt the whalers. After 2 months at sea, they came upon the Russian whaling fleet.
There's 5 over there, there's 1 by the Vostok, and there's 3 over here. There's 9 chasing.
We're coming upon a floating slaughterhouse. There's blood in the water, there's huge slabs of blubber being hauled up on these big factory ships. Blood is just pouring out of this pipe, and the stench alone made us all want to throw up.
Suddenly, Bob and I were in a small boat in front of a Soviet harpoon vessel that was bearing down on us. In front of us is 8 magnificent sperm whales that were fleeing for their life, and every time the harpooner tried to get a shot, I was at the helm, so I would maneuver the boat to try and block the harpoon.
Here's the whales, here's us in our Zodiacs, and here's the Russian ship. We are right between the Soviet ship and the whales. And the harpooner's not shooting, but eventually somebody from the bridge walks down the catwalk and talks to the harpooner, and the harpooner nods and the guy goes back, and Bob looks in his eyes and he knows this guy's going to shoot this harpoon.
Then he looked at us and smiled and brought his finger across his neck, and that's when I realized Gandhi wasn't going to pull through for us that day.
And at that very moment, they fire the harpoon.
This harpoon flew over our head and slammed into the backside of one of the whales, and she screamed. It was a very human-like scream, like a woman, and it took us completely off guard.
The whalers purposefully shoot at a female first because they know that the bull whales will attack them. And then when the bull whales come to attack them, which is exactly what happened,
he was waiting for him and very nonchalantly pulled the trigger and sent a second harpoon into the head of the whale, and he screamed and fell back, and now the water is full of blood everywhere from the 2 dying whales. And as this whale lay and rolled in agony on the surface of the ocean, I caught his eye, and he looked straight at me.
and we're looking into the eye of this huge sperm whale, and I have to tell you, it's sort of beyond emotional. You know, when there's certain moments that are so emotional, you're just in brand new territory.
Why were the Russians killing these whales? You know, they didn't eat sperm whale meat, but they did use the spermaceti oil to make high heat-resistant lubricating oil for machinery. And one of the pieces of machinery that they used it in is the manufacture of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I said, here we are destroying this incredibly beautiful, intelligent, socially complex creature for the purpose of making a weapon meant for the mass destruction of humanity. And that's when I came to me with like a flash. We're insane. We're just totally insane. And from that moment on, I decided that I work for whales, I work for seals, I work for sea turtles and fish and seabirds. I don't work for people.
Greenpeace's new style of media-oriented activism launched them into the wildest ride of any environmental group.
We were out there trying to make the whales famous, but in the process we made ourselves famous. We were now able to talk about ecology, and we were able to raise money. Now we were able to do a seal campaign and a toxic dumping campaign. Offices were springing up all over the world calling themselves Greenpeace.
Their critics claimed that they were better at dramatizing issues than affecting change. But Greenpeace saw the media as the best means of changing consciousness. They called it dropping mind bombs.
My idea was that if you took an image and you passed it through the media into the mass mind, you could essentially blow the mass mind with new images that would create whole new ways of looking at the world. And the image of small whales up against giant whaling machines was a mind bomb.
In 1976, Greenpeace dreamed up their next campaign to save baby harp seals in Newfoundland.
We used the same tactics that we used at the whaling campaigns. We actually got out on the ice, blockaded the sealing ships.
We're blocking the boat.
He's backed up 3 times and came forward already, trying to bluff us off.
No, he might just be lining up for a big one.
The first year, they ran into furious opposition, especially over Paul's plan to spray dye on the seal pups, rendering the pelts worthless.
That's, I think, where I had a first falling out with Bob, really, because they compromised with the Newfoundlanders, and said, well, we're not going to dye the seals if you don't do this. And they didn't consult with me on it, so I was quite angry on it. I don't believe in compromising.
Paul was bitter. He came back the next year, determined to stop the slaughter.
On the second seal campaign in '77, I pulled a sealing club out of a sealer's hand, threw it in the water. I handcuffed myself to the pile of pelts to try and shut down their operations. They pulled the pelts into the water and pulled me through the water and up the side of the boat and dangled me from the air, and then they dropped me back in the water, and then they brought me up on the deck, and then they pulled me along the deck as the sealers were spitting and kicking and punching. Captain came in and started screaming at me about how, it was people like me that ended whaling, and, look, now you're trying to take sealing away from us.
Soon after the second SEAL campaign, Paul Watson was thrown out of Greenpeace for breaching their ethic of nonviolence. He'd gone too far. Paul vowed to pursue the whalers without compromise. He set up his own group, the Sea Shepherd Society, and got himself a ship. The first thing he did was hunt down the Sierra, an illegal pirate whaler. Off the coast of Portugal, he found her.
I hit the Sierra at the bow to get its attention and to destroy the harpoon, then did a 360-degree turn around its stern and slammed into its side at 15 knots and split it open to the waterline. That ship had killed 25,000 whales. What we were able to do in 1 year was to shut down every single pirate whaling vessel in the Atlantic. At the end of that 1 year period, 3 of them were on the bottom, 2 of them were going to be sunk by the South African Navy, and 1 of them had been sold.
Then Sea Shepherd went after whaling nations, scuttling Spanish, Norwegian, and Icelandic whalers.
In 1986, when we sank half of Iceland's whaling fleet, John Frizzell from Greenpeace came up to me. He said, "Just want to let you know that what you did in Iceland was despicable, reprehensible, criminal, and unforgivable." And I said, "So?" And he says, "Well, you should know what people in this movement think about you." I says, "I don't give a damn, John. I didn't sink those whaling vessels for you or anybody in the movement. We sank those whaling vessels for the whales. Find me one whale that disagreed with what we did, and we'll reconsider. But until then, I couldn't give a damn what you people think."
It took everyone working together to ban whaling. For 10 years, radicals and mainstream, governments and NGOs campaigned to turn the International Whaling Commission from hunting to saving whales.
Why should we kill them if it's just like killing us? But they're just nice creatures, they're nice. They wouldn't harm anyone, really.
What we are proposing is a moratorium.
A moratorium finally passed in 1982, and in time it became a permanent ban on whaling, one of environmentalism's biggest successes.
The Amazon was ground zero of global-scale resource issues and crises that arose in the 80s. The greatest rainforest on Earth was threatened on all sides by mining and logging, massive dams, and cattle ranchers. In 1982, Brazil's generals launched a disastrous colonization scheme. Settlers marched into the forest and burnt it down, only to find that the soil was too poor to grow crops. The fate of the Amazon turned on a most unlikely environmental hero, a poor rubber tapper and union organizer named Chico Mendes.
Você sempre é seringueiro?
Sempre fui seringueiro. Meu pai era seringueiro. Eu comecei a cortar com 9 anos de idade. E durante 20 anos eu cortei seringa direto. Só em 75, mais ou menos, quando chegaram os fazendeiros, eu entrei no sindicato. Aí eu parei mais um pouco, cortava menos.
The rubber tappers, known as seringueiros, squatted off the old seringals, or plantations, produced rubber and subsisted off the land. They were protected by being in the remote western Amazon, where roads had not penetrated. But as ranchers arrived and began clearing the land to claim it for tax breaks, Chico Mendes organized the rabbit tappers to defend their territory.
A intenção dos fazendeiros é realmente tomar todas essas terras. Nós não temos nenhuma intenção de... E essa luta nós vamos levá-la até o fim, porque não vamos permitir que as nossas florestas sejam destruídas.
The rabbit tappers organized empates, or standoffs, non-violent protests in the tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, where they surrounded the trees and tried to explain what a disaster cutting down the forest was for everyone.
Pode ficar despreocupado que ninguém...
Não, rapaz, eu não tenho medo.
Claro que não, que você é um trabalhador que nem nós. O objetivo de ficar com tudo nas mãos. Então, uma vez o senhor acabando com essa riqueza que é sua, que é nossa, que é do seringueiro, que é de todo o trabalhador, é uma beleza para eles que eles vão ficar com tudo, porque aqui tudo vai ficar cercado de arame e cheio de boi. E de que nós vamos viver. Então, acima de tudo, companheiros, vocês não são jagunços da fazenda.
But they actually were able to stop the forest cutting by standing in front of the trees. It's a real heroic story, and it happened often enough that it actually impeded an entire cattle ranching operation so much that they gave up.
Que é Fazenda Santa Fé, Fazenda Filipina e outros por aí afora. Mas aqui, que pela primeira vez se teve uma vitória contra o grupo da Bordon, o mais poderoso dessa região. A vitória, por quê? Porque pela primeira vez a gente conseguiu mesmo defender a posse de um companheiro.
American environmentalists helped bring Chico Mendes to the United States to campaign against the World Bank, whose loans led to destructive development.
The World Bank wants us to believe that they are helping the people in those areas. Now, this is a big lie and an infamous lie. The opposite is true. The people living in the forests, they have an interest in their preservation.
I hope that the governments which give money to the IDB, the people of the US, England, Japan, Europe, who contribute their taxes to finance the IDB, will listen to the Seringueros' complaints.
Our subcommittee is going to continue to put pressure on the IDB to withhold funds, to cut off all funds, possibly, if they are not more cooperative.
Chico Mendes, em defesa da floresta amazônica, contra a devastação da mata, contra a expulsão do homem e sua troca pelo boi, pela criação de reservas extrativistas.
Chico was coming to understand that saving their way of life meant saving the Amazon. He began to build alliances with other rabbit tappers and indigenous groups.
Several leaders and Chico decided to hold a meeting to try to form a national council of rubber tappers. What they all came to the conclusion of was that they needed to have rights to use the land. That one of the things that was keeping them from being able to effectively defend the forest against the chainsaw loggers and the cattle ranchers was not having an actual right to this land. They were seen as squatters.
The idea was raised that there should be rubber tapper reserves like Indian reserves. The people wouldn't own the land, but it would be theirs for as long as they wanted to work it. It was an idea of the people who actually lived in the forest. That was a huge breakthrough in concept. This is a great movement within Amazonia, and that's what Chico started.
The rubber tappers decided to establish the first reserve at Cachoeira, the old rubber plantation where Chico was born and lived with family and friends. However, the land had been bought by a rancher named Arli Alves. So the Seringueiros went to court to claim their squatter rights. It turned into a showdown.
Chapuri ranches have always had trouble with Seringueiros blocking their deforestation. Every time the ranchers tried to deforest, they were blocked. In Chapuri, it's stalemate.
We're in immediate danger. We're seeing people killed, and there could be many more.
The Paraná ranch is terrorizing the whole population of Chapuri to strike at me, at Comercindo, at Raimundo Barros, and the whole directorate of our workers' movement.
Queremos que uma conquista pacífica. Mas se chegar o momento de dizer, olha, do lado pacífico não vai dar, e nós não podemos ser demoralizados, nós vamos ter que partir para o confronto, consciente de que alguém vai perder a vida. Nós vamos... Assim mesmo? Assim mesmo?
The rubber tappers won. Cachoeira was declared the first extractive reserve in the world. It was an important victory to the whole of the Amazon. But the rancher Darly Alves had vowed to kill Chico Mendes.
This has not been a bloodless journey. Some have already fallen, defending extractive reserves. No one likes to die, but if it has to happen, then it should be to create more life. I promise, before the blood of our companion Chico Mendes, to continue his work, to show our enemies that they will never succeed in silencing the voice of the Serengueros. Chico Mendes, wherever you are, don't grieve that they have silenced your voice. Your ideas exist among us.
There were things that came together after his death that probably couldn't have come together if he was still alive, because they'd still be fighting over whether the extractive reserves should be established or not. After he was killed, there was no question. So now it's quite clear that who saves forests are the people in the forest.
Chico Mendes' work proved to be the turning point in the battle to save the Amazon. The Brazilian government recognized the rights of the forest peoples and established an array of parks and protected areas. $58 million acres were set aside in extractive reserves. 40% of the Brazilian Amazon was formally protected. However, the fate of the forest is still in doubt. Now it is not just cattle ranchers, but soy farming on an industrial scale and illegal logging.
It was neither the first nor the worst toxic waste dump. What made the difference was the people of Love Canal, led by Lois Gibbs.
You are murderers! Each and every one of you in this room are murderers!
When Love Canal came, it was a new segment of the movement. It wasn't that we don't care about the forest. It was the people focus that set us aside from the other elements that had come before us, and really the focus on if the fish are dying and if the birds are dying, then we're going to die.
Buried beneath the neighborhood were 20,000 tons of poisonous chemicals dumped in an old canal by Hooker Chemical Corporation. Reports of trouble began in 1976, But Love Canal did not explode until Michael Brown, a journalist at the Niagara Gazette, wrote articles exposing the problem. They caught the eye of Lois Gibbs.
I read a newspaper article, and Love Canal had 20,000 tons of chemicals buried in it, and that it was leaking into the neighborhood. And so I read this newspaper, and I said, oh, those poor people. The next day, there was another article, and in that one it talked about the 99th Street Elementary School, and I was like, oh my goodness. That's where Michael's going to kindergarten. That's why Michael's so sick.
Lois tried to get her son transferred to another school, but the superintendent refused.
When I met with Dr. Long, he said, I am not about to move 407 children because of one irate, hysterical housewife with a sickly kid.
Instead, Lois began to circulate a petition to close the school. She went door to door, discovering the extent of the damage.
I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I thought I was the only one with a sickly child. I thought I was the only family that was affected by these leaking chemicals from Love Canal. In their basement, you could see where the chemical residue just comes up through the basement floor and just pools there, and it smells. It smells like a chemical factory. It's nasty.
When Lois took her case to the state, officials surprised her with an emergency declaration to evacuate the nearest homes. However, the outer ring of homes surrounding Love Canal, 800 families, were given nothing. The state bought the inner ring of houses. Then they put up a fence and began to excavate. Love Canal residents outside the fence felt trapped.
When did the state tell you to stop growing your vegetable garden?
In August of '78.
So they weren't willing to move you out, but they were willing to tell you to stop growing vegetables.
Willing to tell us not to have the kids go barefooted, not to have them go in the basement. Don't plant a garden, but enjoy your house. Live there with your family while we continue doing our tests and use you as guinea pigs.
The Love Canal residents decided to do their own health study and found an alarming increase in disease and birth defects.
We truly believed if we can prove that there is an increase in disease, they, meaning the government, will do the right thing. And we found that 56% of the children in our community were born with birth defects. 56% of our children had 3 ears, double rows of teeth, extra fingers, extra toes, or were mentally retarded. During that study time, there were 22 women who were pregnant, and of those 22 pregnancies, only 4 normal babies were born. And the health department literally threw the health study on the floor. I mean, literally took it and just threw it on the floor and said, it's useless housewife data collected by people who have a vested interest in the outcome.
The New York State Health Department was prodded into doing its own health study and presented their findings to a packed meeting in Love Canal.
The health commissioner took the stage and said, we found that 56% of the children in Love Canal were born with birth defects. And we're secretly, as sick as it sounds, saying, yes, yes, and now you're going to evacuate us, right? I mean, that's what we're hoping for. And then he says, but we don't believe those birth defects are related to Love Canal. And it's just the whole audience, you could hear, huh? I mean, it was just like, and it's like, we believe that those birth defects are related to a random clustering of genetically defective people.
Get tired and then we love night Larry's poison in the well. Everybody's going to hell. There is poison in the well. Dead man downtown.
For the residents, Love Canal became a 2-year struggle to get relocated. Lois Gibbs pushed relentlessly and finally forced the state to bring in the federal government. The Environmental Protection Agency launched a pilot study of chromosome damage. The results of the tests were explosive.
We will then decide whether this evidence
added to the cumulative knowledge that we already have from other health and environmental studies at Love Canal, justifies a recommendation for relocation of the residents or other appropriate actions to assist those in the area.
It seems to me that the federal government has finally, after 2 years, come up to the high-level thinking of housewives that they have constantly put down. We know what's going on. We did research, too, and we want out of there. We want our kids out. Not on Wednesday, today.
Homeowners and all our hard work. You get
At last, President Carter came to Love Canal to sign the agreement buying out the homeowners.
The whole question of the disposal of hazardous waste, especially toxic chemicals, is going to be one of the great environmental challenges of the 1980s. There must never be, in our country, another Love Canal. Thank you very much.
Jimmy Carter had a terrific energy policy that had a goal of getting at least 20% of the nation's energy from renewable energy resources by the year 2000, and a series of proposed policies that, had they been implemented, actually would have gotten us there. He had solar water heaters installed on the White House roof.
A generation from now, this solar heater can either be a curiosity, a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or it can be just a small part of one of the greatest ventures ever undertaken by the American people.
They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been. That the America of the coming years will be a place where, because of our past excesses, it will be impossible to dream and make those dreams come true. I don't believe that, and I don't believe you do either. That's why I'm seeking the presidency. I cannot and will not stand by and see this great country destroy itself. Our leaders attempt to blame their failures on circumstances beyond their control, on false estimates by unknown, unidentifiable experts who rewrite modern history in an attempt to convince us our high standard of living, the result of thrift and hard work, is somehow selfish extravagance, which we must renounce as we join in sharing scarcity.
The Reagan White House has finally dismantled the last vestiges of the Carter administration. Workmen have now taken down the solar water heating system installed on the White House roof in 1979.
There is environmental extremism. I don't think they'll be happy until the White House looks like a bird's nest.
You and I and other ordinary people around the world can do will not by itself save the natural world. The great decisions, the great disasters that face us can only be dealt with by governments. And that's why this organization is so important.
The nuclear disaster in Chernobyl was an event that has sent shockwaves around the globe, and its effects are still being felt to the present day. It was another nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union because it exposed in a dramatic fashion the political, economic and managerial failures of communism. In addition, it influenced the debate about nuclear power until the present day.
On November 1st, 1986, a fire broke out at the storehouse of Swiss company Sandoz near Basel. The water used to put out the fire wound up in the Rhine River. It was the largest environmental disaster in a European river. The laws didn't require companies to build special reservoirs for water that remains after a fire. No one saw an environmental disaster coming, and the outrage was universal. This awful disaster highlighted an issue that had been building up for years. After all, the Rhine had long been known as Europe's cesspool. The authorities of Switzerland, Germany, France and the Netherlands adopted a broad program aimed at saving this major European waterway. More than 80 billion euro has been spent to build water treatment plants on the Rhine. One such plant was built in Duisburg, Germany. It purifies the water that comes from sewers and drains. The mechanical and biological treatment takes up to 24 hours. After which, the water goes back into the Rhine. But even advanced treatment facilities like this can't make the river absolutely clean. If you have ever poured out some unneeded medicines into sewers, this waste would most likely get through all the clearing units. The consequences of the 1986 environmental disaster have very much been reversed. Fish have returned to the Rhine, but swimming in the river has long been prohibited. It's too hard to offset the human impact on the river. It's a typical example of the Anthropocene age. But the silver lining of this disaster is that now environmental protection in Western Europe has assumed a new status.
Margaret Thatcher became the first world leader to warn about the dangers of global warming.
The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations.
Margaret Thatcher was uniquely qualified among world leaders to evaluate the science of climate, with a chemistry degree from Oxford and experience as a researcher. She may have been aware of how advanced military programs on heat-seeking missiles clearly detailed the physics of the greenhouse effect as early as the 1950s, and that a high-level scientific panel wrote to President Johnson in 1965, warning that man is unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment with greenhouse gases. She may have read the scientific journals in the 1970s that warned of emerging global warming, or heard the words of leading researchers in the field. She was probably aware of the U.S. National Academy of Science assessment in 1979 that affirmed the science and warned that a wait-and-see attitude on climate change might mean waiting until it was too late. Certainly she wouldn't have missed the many news reports on the issue.
Researchers say increasingly large amounts of CO2 are accumulating in the atmosphere. They fear the Earth will gradually become warmer, causing as yet uncertain but possibly disruptive changes in the Earth's climate.
In the sweltering summer of 1988, almost everyone noticed when a senior NASA scientist, James Hansen, came before a congressional panel with a statement that seems more than prescient today.
The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. It is as menacing in its way as those more accustomed perils with which international diplomacy has concerned itself for centuries. It is the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, to the oceans, to Earth itself. What we are now doing to the world, by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters, and by adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. The result is that change in future is likely to be more fundamental and more widespread than anything we have known hitherto. The environmental challenge which confronts the whole world demands an equivalent response from the whole world. Every country will be affected, and no one can opt out. Reason is humanity's special gift. It allows us to understand the structure of the nucleus. It enables us to explore the heavens. It helps us to conquer disease. Now we must use our reason to find a way in which we can live with nature and not dominate nature. We need our reason to teach us today that we are not, that we must not try to be, lords of all we survey. We are not the lords. We are the Lord's creatures, the trustees of this planet, charged today with preserving life itself, preserving life with all its mystery and all its wonder. May we all be equal to that task.
Una importante especie biológica está en riesgo de desaparecer por la rápida y progresiva liquidación de sus condiciones naturales de vida, el hombre. Ahora tomamos conciencia de este problema cuando casi es tarde para impedirlo. Es necesario señalar que las sociedades de consumo son las responsables fundamentales de la atroz destrucción del medio ambiente. Ellas nacieron de las antiguas metrópolis coloniales y de políticas imperiales que a su vez engendraron el atraso y la pobreza que ellos azotan a la inmensa mayoría de la humanidad. Con solo el 20% de la población mundial, ellas consumen las 2/3 partes de los metales y las 3/4 partes de la energía que se produce en el mundo. Han envenenado los mares y ríos, han contaminado el aire, han debilitado y perforado la capa de ozono, han saturado la atmósfera de gases que alteran las condiciones climáticas, con efectos catastróficos que ya empezamos a padecer.
Senator Al Gore, author of the book Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit. What's it all about?
It's about a global ecological crisis that is, in my opinion, the most serious problem our world faces. It covers a lot of seemingly separate problems that are all part of the same underlying crisis. You know the old parable about the blind men and the elephant? One had a hold of a leg, the other the trunk, the other the tail, and it took them some time to realize that all of these separate parts were parts of the same large entity. When I first got involved in studying about problems relating to the environment, I had some similar difficulties. I saw the problem of ozone depletion and climate change, toxic waste disposal, the rainforest destruction, all as seemingly separate problems. I've now come to the conclusion that they are all symptoms of a deeper underlying crisis, which is a collision between our civilization as it's currently constituted and the ecological system of the Earth.
Since the first Summit on Sustainable Development in 1972 in Stockholm, environmental issues have slowly crept up the international agenda. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro laid the foundations of green diplomacy. It resulted in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Every year since 1995, the Conference of Parties to the Convention, known as COP, brings together signatory states to try to combat climate change by reducing emissions. This annual summit also formed the basis for 1997's Kyoto Protocol. The treaty committed 37 industrialized countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 5.2% against 1990 levels by 2012. but no restrictions were imposed on developing countries like China and India, despite both being significant polluters. In 2009, COP15 in Copenhagen failed to deliver a new global treaty. It ended instead with a non-binding agreement to take action to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius without explaining how this would happen. The COP17 summit in 2011 resulted in the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, committing countries including the United States and China to deliver a new legally binding agreement in 2015. The 21st Climate Change Conference in Paris, known as COP21, aims to secure the first universally recognised accord to try to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. Scientists warn that any increase above this could have devastating consequences.
Nous voici donc presque au bout du chemin et sans doute au début d'un autre. Je veux d'abord vous remercier, toutes et tous. À chaque étape, l'objectif a été de nous rapprocher ensemble de l'accord souhaité par tous, de contenir l'augmentation de la température moyenne bien en deçà de 2 degrés et de s'efforcer de limiter cette augmentation à 1,5 degré.
We can look into the eyes of our children, our grandchildren, and we can finally tell them that we have joined hands to bequeath a more habitable world to them and to future generations.
It is an agreement of conviction. It is an agreement of solidarity with the most vulnerable. It is an agreement of long-term vision, because it is an agreement of commitment to turn this new legal framework into the engine of safe growth for all, for the rest of this century. We end this COP celebrating a new chapter of hope for the world.
Le 12 décembre 2015 restera une grande date pour la planète. À Paris, il y a eu bien des révolutions depuis des siècles. Mais aujourd'hui, c'est la plus belle et la plus pacifique des révolutions qui vient d'être accomplie, la révolution pour le changement climatique.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Since its invention some 100 years ago, plastic has become an integral part of our daily lives. But every year, some 8 million tons of it ends up in the ocean. And there, it can be lethal.
We're in the middle of really profound change, no question about it.
But this, to me, is the most exciting new development. Virtually every nation in the entire world agreed to get to zero greenhouse emissions. It is unprecedented. We're seeing a tremendous amount of positive change. The basis is there, but it's still not enough.
It's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming. It's time to put America first. That includes a promise to cancel billions in climate change spending. Our plan will end the EPA.
The next generation would be justified in looking back at us and asking, what were you thinking? Couldn't you hear what the scientists were saying? Couldn't you hear what Mother Nature was screaming at you? This movement is in the tradition of every great movement that has advanced humankind.
We're not going to recognize it. We don't want to discuss it.
It is right to save humanity. It is wrong to pollute this earth. It is right to give hope to the future generation. Don't let anybody tell you that we're going to get on rocket ships and live on Mars. This is our home.